Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a crucial and really extensive deep dive into a text that didn't just analyze a system, it actually gave millions of people the vocabulary to see themselves and their society clearly for the very first time.
We're talking about Betty Friedan's seminal 1963 work, The Feminine Mystique.
That's the one.
And we're jumping right into the core issue here. What Friedan diagnosed was, it was a revolutionary way of understanding widespread unhappiness.
It really was.
The central idea that we're unpacking is why this personal dissatisfaction, especially for women in mid-century America, living in these seemingly perfect suburbs, was almost always framed as an individual failure.
Right, it was your fault. It was trivialized, internalized.
Pathologized even. You were told it was your fault for, not being grateful enough or not prioritizing your husband's career.
Or, and this is a classic, not getting the kitchen sink white enough.
Exactly. Some small domestic failing was the source of your existential despair.
But the book, it just shifts the entire frame.
Yeah.
It argues that this misery, this strange stirring, as she calls it, was not an individual failure at all. It was a direct, predictable, and, well, even a mandatory symptom of a meticulously crafted social design.
So the unhappiness was systemic, not personal.
Precisely. It was the product of a cultural framework that imposed these profound limitations on basically half the population.
And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We're going beyond just a summary, and we're going to examine in detail how those systemic pressures and expectations were, for lack of a better word, engineered.
Yeah, we're looking at the specific institutional forces,
Yeah.
the media, psychology, education.
Even architecture, all of these things that ruthlessly shaped and enforced women's roles in post-war America.
And it's so important that we emphasize the tone of the source material here.
Right.
This deep dive is about diagnosing that cultural framework. The book isn't really assigning individual blame to the women who bought into the mystique, or even the men who upheld it. Instead, it's trying to analyze this self-reinforcing structure that produced so much distress, so much anxiety.
And a genuine, crippling sense of non-existence.
A sense of non-existence, yes, for women whose intelligence and education just far exceeded the demands of their assigned domestic life.
Okay, so to understand the just explosive impact this book had in 1963, we have to situate the author, Betty Friedan, in her world.
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't just some academic in an ivory tower. She was a writer, an activist, and a feminist theorist who had actually lived the contradictions she eventually wrote about.
Her journey to this diagnosis was intensely personal, which I think is why the book feels less like a dry academic text and more like, a manifesto of necessary self-discovery.
So she had firsthand experience with this.
Absolutely. Friedan had been working as a journalist, and she was famously fired from a newspaper job for the crime of being pregnant.
Wow.
And she internalized that culture's message. She felt this profound guilt about suppressing what she called her writing itch. So she moved to the suburbs and she attempted to live the prescribed life.
But it didn't take.
Well, her own experiences and what she was seeing with her friends and neighbors, it made her really uneasy. She observed what she calls a strange discrepancy, and this really defines the book.
What was the discrepancy?
It's the dissonance between the glossy, widely broadcast image of the fulfilled, modern American suburban housewife, the woman who had everything, and the miserable, anxious reality of the women who were actually living that life.
And that discrepancy became the genesis of the book.
Exactly. In 1957, she started with this intensive questionnaire of her Smith College classmates 15 years after they had graduated.
So highly educated women.
The best of the best. Privileged women who, by all accounts, had achieved the American dream, and yet the results were consistent. These women felt trapped, isolated, and profoundly unhappy.
That must have been a huge confirmation for her.
It confirmed her suspicion entirely. The problem was collective, not unique to her.
Which means we really have to look at the context of this post-war paradox itself. The 1950s and early 60s were so economically prosperous.
Incredibly. America was stable, it was thriving, and it was characterized by this near-obsessive focus on home-centered family life. That was the mystique. It was the cultural ideology that defined the entire era.
Prosperity was supposed to equal happiness.
Precisely. But for women, ambition and intellectual life were actively, even institutionally, discouraged. If you look at the numbers cited in the source material, the data is just shocking.
What does it show?
The proportion of women attending college dropped dramatically. It went from 47% in 1920 down to just 35% in 1958.
So it actually went backward.
It went backward. And this wasn't just a statistical dip. It was a societal message being sent loud and clear.
And that's where you can really see the systemic pressures becoming visible. Girls were now going to college not to pursue a career or, knowledge for its own sake.
No, they were going to get a husband. That was the primary goal. They operated under this profound societal fear that too much education was, and this is a quote, a marriage bar.
If you're too smart, you're unmarriageable.
Exactly. Too ambitious, too focused on intellectual pursuits, you risk being seen as unfeminine or, even worse, just not marriage material.
And the culture actually celebrated this.
Oh, it celebrated this educational retreat. The book points out the prevalence of the PhD degree.
The PhD.
It stood for putting husband through. The culture praised women for sacrificing their own potential, for their husband's career, for their children's security. And this dominant narrative was applauded by thousands of expert voices. Psychologists, educators, media editors.
All celebrating a woman's adjustment to the Dusik role.
Yes, calling it the pinnacle of female maturity and mental health.
But this raises a really fundamental question that Friedan just relentlessly pursued. Adjustment to what? The book's power is in how it challenges this entire apparatus, the psychological, the cultural, the media structures, that all insisted this one domestic role, stripped of any intellectual engagement, was the sole source of female fulfillment.
The entire culture was colluding in a way to define women by what they lacked outside the home, to basically deny their existence as individuals in the professional, intellectual, or political world.
So that brings us to the central thesis of the feminine mystique. Can we state it clearly?
I think we can. The narrowly defined domestic ideal, the feminine mystique, systemically produced widespread psychological distress because it actively denied women opportunities for growth, for purpose, for meaningful work that actually used their intelligence and education.
So fulfillment was reduced to something else.
It was tragically reduced to a purely sexual and maternal identity. And this ensured that any woman who tried to use her full human potential was forced to feel guilty, neurotic, or pathologically male-identified.
Once she establishes that core argument, the book moves into a kind of diagnosis, starting with its most famous concept.
Yes, the problem that has no name.
What exactly was it?
It was this universal, yet completely silent experience of millions of suburban wives. It was the strange stirring, the sense of vague dissatisfaction and yearning that women were suffering alone in their beautiful appliance-filled homes.
And they were afraid to even talk about it.
Afraid to voice it, even to themselves. They were asking that terrifying, silent question, is this all?
And because there was no name for it, no vocabulary to describe, structural oppression or cultural limits,
women automatically framed it as individual failure. They felt empty somehow, incomplete, or, and this is the most chilling description from the sources, as if I don't exist.
In a culture that equated femininity with being happy at home, that feeling of emptiness must have been terrifying. It was like evidence that you were failing at the one thing society demanded from you.
It was. And to cope with this internal terror, women engaged in these elaborate forms of psychological evasion. They tried to mask the emptiness. Well, often with prescription tranquilizers like Miltown or Valium, which were just widely prescribed to suburban housewives at the time.
So they medicated the problem away.
They tried to.
Oh.
Or they externalized the blame, focusing on their husband's stress or their children's bad grades. Or they'd convince themselves the problem could be solved externally by redecorating the house, buying a new gadget, or just having another baby.
But the cost of suppressing all of this was enormous, and it started to manifest physically, didn't it? Doctors began observing these clusters of psychosomatic illnesses.
They did. They termed them the housewife syndrome, and, even more starkly, housewife's blight.
Housewife's blight, that's a powerful phrase.
It is, and this is a specific, powerful detail from the source material that really brings the suffering to life. One physician reported seeing great bleeding blisters on the hands and arms of these young mothers who, quote, bury themselves in their dishpans.
Wow, and this wasn't from detergent.
The physician was clear in his analysis. This was not caused by detergent, and it wasn't cured by cortisone. These were somatic manifestations. The body was literally revolting against the spiritual and intellectual vacuum of the domestic role.
So the body was acting out the suppression of the self.
Desperately trying to feel something concrete, even if it was pain. The picture of utter desperation, where the very act of living the prescribed life becomes pathologically self-destructive.
And for the educated woman, the primary coping mechanism was this kind of frantic busyness, right? An evasion through busyness.
Absolutely. The source material notes that educated women, denied meaningful work that could use their potential, fought this existential emptiness by maniacally expanding housewifery to fill every single available minute.
So they turned chores into projects.
They elevated repetitive chores into high-status, time-consuming projects. They collected for charities. They volunteered for every school board role. They chauffeured endlessly, shopped compulsively. It was all a desperate attempt to avoid confronting the unbearable vacuum of their lives.
There's that one anecdote from the book that's just heartbreaking. A mother of 4 who tried everything.
I remember that one. Hobbies, gardening, pickling, canning. I can do it all, and I like it, but it doesn't leave you anything to think about, any feeling of who you are.
The busyness was a defense mechanism.
It was a structured distraction. The goal was to prevent the woman from ever having the quiet, empty time necessary to ask that dangerous, self-defining question. What do I want to do with my intelligence?
And this psychological suppression wasn't an accident. It was being actively reinforced by cultural institutions.
Most notably, mass media and the advertising industry. The book argues that the media wasn't just reflecting this domestic ideal, it was actively manufacturing and enforcing it.
There's a documented dramatic shift in the narrative.
A huge shift. The image of the spirited, independent career girl, the kind of woman you'd see in magazines in the 1930s and 40s, often created by women editors, was systematically replaced.
And replaced with what?
By the 1950s, the dominant image was the passive, fulfilled housewife mother. And this image was overwhelmingly created and controlled by male editors and corporate advertising interests.
And this systemic control created what the book calls the editorial trap.
Yes. Editors operated under this profitable, self-fulfilling belief that, quote, American women won't identify with anything outside of home, children, and sex.
But that wasn't based on what women actually wanted.
No, it was based on what the editors wanted women to want. And this ensured that magazines were filled only with trivial details. Diets, clothes, beauty tips, hyper-focused child-rearing advice.
Or, and this is a critical point, external issues were domesticated. They were neutered.
Exactly. This mechanism of trivialization is where the system really shows its hand. An article on, say, the economy or civil rights was deemed unreadable by women unless it was translated into these highly specific biological or domestic terms they could understand.
Like what?
Like romance, pregnancy, nursing, home furnishings.
The examples from the book are just incredible.
They're so revealing. When Thurgood Marshall spoke about desegregation, the editors didn't even consider running the story because, as they said, you just can't link it to women's world.
And the one about the atom bomb?
That one is unbelievable. A natural childbirth expert submitted an article called How to Have a Baby in an Atom Bomb Shelter. They didn't want women to contemplate the abstract, devastating power of the atom bomb to destroy humanity. That was seen as too complex, too intellectual.
They just wanted her to focus on the biological details of birth.
Even in the most apocalyptic scenario imaginable, the message was clear. Your domain is biological, not intellectual or political.
And the ultimate driving force behind this entire media machine was the consumer imperative.
Yes. Friedan's pivotal rhetorical question exposes this beautifully. Why is it never said that the really crucial function, the really important role that women serve as housewives, is to buy more things for the house?
Because that was the real job.
That was the job. The truth was, housework was inherently dull, it was repetitive, and it lacked any professional structure. Therefore, advertising had to become the textbook for life.
It had to give the illusion of professional status to cleaning.
Precisely. It created the need for multiple, highly specialized products, different waxes, different mops, specific detergents for specific fabrics, forcing the housewife to become an expert in trivia just to feel some sense of achievement or competence.
That's the core psychological manipulation right there.
It is. Advertisers had to constantly invent ways to make boring housework seem like a creative achievement, often by inducing profound guilt if a woman didn't use a new product that promised more efficiency or more happiness.
The goal was to sell consumer objects as replacements for identity, for purpose, for a real contribution to the community.
The illusion was simple. Fulfillment can be bought, and only the best shopper is truly feminine.
So the media provided the script, but psychology, or a very specific, rigid version of Freudian theory, provided the scientific justification for it all.
It did. It gave the whole system a veneer of scientific authority.
Now, this is a complex point, and the book is careful about its critique here.
It is. Friedan didn't argue that Freud was inherently wrong. She argued that Freud was an accurate, if limited, observer of middle-class Victorian women in Vienna. He saw their envy of men's freedom, power, and autonomy.
But he misinterpreted the cause.
He interpreted those symptoms through the lens of his own restrictive culture, labeling them as biological products rather than cultural ones.
And this faulty interpretation led directly to the concept of anatomy as destiny.
Which was weaponized in America. The concept of penis envy was twisted into a cultural cudgel. Any ambition, any desire for intellectual contribution, any pursuit of a career was dismissed immediately as a neurosis.
It was seen as an unhealthy desire to be male.
Or a sublimated modification of the repressed wish for a penis. It's a perfect self-sealing loop. If you were content being a housewife, you were healthy. If you were unhappy or you wanted more out of life, you were pathologically trying to reject your femininity and become a man. You were sick, and you needed adjustment, not social change.
And Freudian followers, figures like Helene Deutsch, they institutionalized this rigidity.
They did. They equated feminine passive with masculine active in all spheres of life, not just in sexual relationships. And this provided a seemingly scientific justification for women's complete subordination, their passivity, their exclusion from the competitive world of ideas and work.
The tragic consequence, as the book notes, was the passivity prescription.
Yes. The insistence on this rigid adjustment led to psychological rigidity and unchangeability in women, especially those over the age of 30. They had consciously suppressed their ambition for so long that the very engine of self-growth had, atrophied.
Ambition wasn't just discouraged by society.
It was pathologized by the mental health establishment, forcing women to forfeit their own existence just to gain societal acceptance.
So all this energy, this intellectual and professional drive that was being blocked, it had to go somewhere.
It had to. And the ultimate tragic cost of this identity reduction falls upon the children, creating what Friedan calls the cult of the child.
Meaning what exactly?
When a woman's sense of self and purpose is denied outside the home, all her intellectual and emotional energy is forced to overinvest in her offspring. Her relationship with the child becomes not just nurturing, but a love affair or a symbiosis.
So the child is forced to provide the mother's only sense of identity and achievement.
The mother is, in effect, living vicariously through the child.
And this symbiotic relationship, according to the psychological studies the book cites, leads directly to pathological motherhood.
It does. The sources detail high rates of maternal overprotection, or in severe cases, maternal psychoses, things like depression and breakdown over childbirth, which were particularly prevalent in the prosperous suburbs of the 1950s.
The statistics are pretty stark.
They're chilling. In some areas, the condition was affecting 1 out of every 3 young mothers. Mothers, blocked from channeling their feminine energy into meaningful, creative work, were producing pathologically infantile sons who remained forever enwombed, unable to fully separate and achieve independent selfhood.
And that stifling, vicarious existence contributed to what the book calls the passive generation.
Yes, these were the children often characterized as the bored, lazy, gimme kids who lacked the ability to cope with frustration, to exert sustained effort, or to develop any genuine internal initiative. They were, in a word, psychologically smothered.
And the book makes an incredibly radical and profound leap here, connecting this domestic problem to a national character crisis.
It really does. It links this softness and lack of ego development to these shocking findings about American GI prisoners captured during the Korean War.
What were the findings?
A staggering 38% of those prisoners died, and many of them suffered from something called give-up-itis. They lacked the essential Yankee resourcefulness, the ability to innovate and struggle for survival when structures broke down.
And the analysis was that this was connected to their upbringing.
The analysis was that they had been raised in an environment that seemed inimical to clarity and growth, resulting in massive ego failure. The seemingly benign domestic environment was, in fact, producing existential fragility.
So the ultimate counter to the mystique, then, comes from a deeper understanding of human potential. Friedan brings in the research of humanistic psychologists like Abraham Maslow.
Yes, on self-actualizing people. This connection is vital. Maslow distinguished between deficiency needs, like hunger, safety, belonging, and being needs, like self-fulfillment, truth, and beauty.
And the feminine mystique reduced women's existence to just those deficiency needs.
Exactly. Securing a home, attracting a mate. But Maslow's data confirmed that fulfillment, including sexual fulfillment, is linked directly to what he called dominance feeling, or self-esteem, which comes from pursuing those being needs.
There was a remarkable correlation in the data, wasn't
A
there?
stunning one. Highly educated women who pursued professional careers reported far greater sexual enjoyment and orgasm rates, and were less likely to seek extramarital sex than those who had lower education and accepted the passive domestic role.
So the true path to fulfillment is clear.
It's that human identity today is no longer dictated solely by biological survival or simple deficiency needs. It's dictated by the need for creative work that contributes meaningfully to the human community. It serves as the giver of self and the transcender of self.
And when women were denied that work,
They were forced into a desperate, endless cycle of consumerism, overmothering, and a sexual hunger that could never be satisfied because the core engine of their identity had been starved.
okay, so now that we've broken down the core ideas, let's synthesize these forces. We can see pretty clearly how the post-war domestic ideal functioned as this sophisticated, self-reinforcing system.
Right, which Friedan famously and controversially likened to a comfortable concentration camp.
Okay, wait, I want to pause on that phrase. It's inherently provocative. How does Friedan justify equating a prosperous, secure suburban life with a concentration camp, even a comfortable one?
She does, and it's a shocking phrase, I know.
Ugh.
She justifies it by defining the term not by physical suffering, but by psychological imprisonment.
Okay.
A concentration camp is a structure designed to strip prisoners of their previous identity and reduce them to mere biological function, or a utility for the system. The comfortable concentration camp provided physical comfort and security, but it ruthlessly denied the prisoners, the housewives, their full intellectual and professional existence.
So the goal was psychological erasure.
Exactly. It was designed to ensure they could not escape, mentally or physically, from their designated role.
And the genius of her critique is showing how these diverse, seemingly unrelated actors who weren't necessarily, in a room together colluding, all worked toward the same restrictive end.
We created a robust, multi-layered system of control. Let's map the structure by looking at the actors and their specific roles.
Okay, first up, advertisers and industry. What was their role in maintaining this system?
They provided the core incentive, which was consumerism. Their message was simple and irresistible. Happiness and status are purchasable.
And they reinforced the belief that being an expert housekeeper
Was a socially acceptable substitute for real, paid achievement in the world. They literally sold women what they ought to want, redirecting the powerful human need for contribution into the safe, profitable channels of consumption.
and then providing the intellectual scaffolding for all of this, we had functionalist sociology and psychology. We should probably spend a moment here explaining the weight they carried.
This is so critical for understanding why the mystique felt scientifically inevitable to so many people. Functionalist thinkers, particularly Taka Parsons, argue that society requires rigid, segregated sex roles to maintain cultural stability.
The man has the instrumental role, and the woman has the expressive role.
Precisely. The man worked outside. The woman maintained the emotional balance inside. This theory provided the scientific veneer, the intellectual justification, arguing that these separate spheres were not just traditional, but structurally necessary.
And even someone as progressive as Margaret Mead, who lived this incredibly independent, career-focused life, even she contributed to the structural pressure.
Paradoxically, yes. Mead, using her huge anthropological influence, warned women against competition or seeking roles outside the home because, as the book states, it frightens the men, unsexes the women.
So the highly educated elite were providing the narrative of adjustment.
Arguing that societal stability was simply more important than an individual woman's intellectual potential.
And finally, we have the educators. They weren't just passively accepting the status quo, they were active agents in this system.
They became explicitly sex-directed. Colleges were actively discouraging intellectual ambition in favor of marriage readiness. They steered women away from demanding professional fields.
Thus ensuring women were psychologically and intellectually unprepared to break free later in life.
Right. There's a professor cited in the book who lamented that his senior honor students were interfering with the final seminar because of kitchen showers. Education, which should have been the key to liberation, was repurposed into a mechanism for finding a mate.
So these actors created the trap. Now let's examine the three core feedback loops that made the system so self-reinforcing.
Loop 1 is role restriction, and was often built right into the physical environment itself. The modern, open-plan suburban house, which was being built from coast to coast, structurally reinforced the woman's role.
Oh, so?
The architecture ensured the housewife was never truly alone. The book points out there was no door at all between kitchen and living room.
So the open plan, which was celebrated as modern and communal, was also a subtle form of constant surveillance.
Exactly. It limited privacy and, crucially, it limited the opportunity for serious disruptive thought. You cannot study philosophy or write a novel when you are perpetually available to your children, your husband, and the demands of the visible household. The physical structure enforced perpetual availability, and that crushed intellectual space.
Okay, so loop two is the dissatisfaction cycle. The emptiness and despair generated by this restrictive role required a temporary fix.
And that fix was compulsive action. The emptiness led to excessive childbearing. Women would say things like, I can't just keep on having babies, but they kept doing it to find some temporary purpose.
Or it led to compulsive spending.
Yes, a woman would buy a new Plymouth to try and gain a new identity, only to find the void returned a few weeks later. The temporary action never resolved the core lack of identity. It just pushed the woman back to the beginning of the cycle. Buy more, consume more, distract yourself further.
And the third loop, which caused immense interpersonal damage, was the masculine reaction. This system was destroying relationships precisely because it was working so well.
The problem was that the suppressed energy of the wife didn't just vanish. It became aggressive, frustrated, and it was often subtly directed at her husband, who was supposed to be the source of her happiness.
The book says the woman became furniture in their own homes.
Yeah. The husband, facing this aggressive, frustrated woman who was dependent on him, yet clearly unhappy, often reacted with hostility. He'd seek solace, extramarital sex, or divorce, and he'd blame her lack of true femininity.
So the system designed to keep women contentedly in the home ultimately made the home destructive to every single person inside it.
It was a trap for everyone.
It's tempting to look at all this and conclude that the feminine mystique is a closed chapter of history. But what's so fascinating is how the core architecture of the problem persists, and it's fueling our most intense modern anxieties about work and family.
We've made undeniable progress, of course. We see women in policymaking, we have legal recourse for sexual harassment, but the book forces us to look deeper at the structural foundations.
And the fundamental problem remains.
It does. The modern career structure, how we define a full-time job, how we define success, how we run meetings, is still, as the book says, based on the lives of the men of the past who had wives to take care of the details of life.
That outdated structure is the engine driving the entire work-life balance debate today. It assumes a worker is unencumbered by domestic responsibility.
Which is simply not true for most people, and it's disproportionately untrue for women.
This is why Friedan's later advocacy, which is outlined in the source material, was so crucial. She started focusing on structural, not just personal, solutions.
She argued for something radical, a nationwide campaign for a shorter work week, maybe 30 hours. She argued that just as the 40-hour week was achieved a half-century prior, the working structure must adapt to the needs of modern families, especially during child-rearing years.
And yet structural support is still lagging so dramatically in the U.S.
It really is. We often hear about political priorities, but structural issues like community childcare and parental leave are telltale signs of the persistence of the old mystique. The source material points out that the U.S. was the last advanced industrial nation, except for South Africa, to adopt a national parental leave policy,
which suggests an ongoing systemic failure to treat care labor as a societal priority,
instead of treating it as an individualized female responsibility. And this leads directly to the having it all myth, which is really just the contemporary mystique.
So what is that myth?
It's that women have successfully entered the professional world, but now they're expected to seamlessly add the demands of a modern career onto the existing undiminished responsibilities of the 1950s housewife.
They're carrying the notorious second shift.
They are. And while the sources note that men's contribution to housework and childcare has risen significantly up to 40% from the 20% they once contributed,
women still shoulder the majority of the logistical, mental, and emotional load, what sociologists call the mental labor.
And here is the psychological trap that's still persisting. Women still claim the nurturing power. There's this strange, powerful, psychological clinging to the domestic role, even when it creates enormous stress.
We hear it in that anecdote from the source material.
The one that goes, I wouldn't consider letting Ben take him to the doctor. That's my thing. Women, having fought for decades to gain power outside the home, often find a sense of indispensable control in retaining the veto power over nurturing and domestic perfection. They're substituting identity through control for identity through creation.
So, if the structural problems haven't been fixed, then the pattern of individualizing systemic failure must also persist.
It does. We're often encouraged to see our exhaustion, our marital strife, our professional stagnation as personal flaws.
Hmm.
We didn't lean in hard enough, or we need more self-care, or our marriage failed because of personality clashes.
And the source material warns explicitly about this pattern.
It does. It suggests that the modern focus on sexual politics, like an obsession with local workplace harassment charges, is sometimes a dangerous symptom that masks the real threats to empowerment.
And those real threats are systemic.
They're systemic. Corporate greed, job downsizing, stagnant wages, and economic anxieties that affect everyone.
That's a powerful connection. It suggests that economic frustrations, which harm both men and women, are often translated into interpersonal gender conflict.
Right. Instead of recognizing that the corporation's demands are impossible for any family, regardless of gender, we blame each other for not fulfilling these obsolete roles.
And that distraction prevents a unified focus on fixing the fundamental economic systems.
Absolutely. Instead of demanding a 30-hour work week or universal childcare or a living wage structural changes that would benefit all families, we're diverted into these smaller, localized battles. This keeps us exhausted, dependent, and fundamentally vulnerable to the very systems that profit from our exhaustion.
The system ensures we fight each other over who cleans the kitchen.
Rather than uniting to fight the structure that requires one person to work 50 hours a week while the other manages an entire household infrastructure alone.
This deep dive into the feminine mystique fits so perfectly within our broader focus on crisis and perception, because it is just a masterclass in how culture manufactures consent.
Absolutely. The book reveals, with surgical precision, how pervasive cultural messages, from magazines and ads to Freudian popularizers, persuade people to accept severe limitations as not only natural, but profoundly desirable.
The culture manipulators explicitly sell them what they ought to want.
They harness women's basic human need for purpose and contribution and project it entirely onto consumer objects.
The result is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is. By trivializing the real world, the media created generations of women who genuinely became disinterested in politics, science, or abstract thought, thus proving the editor's original claim that they only cared about babies and clothes. It literally trained women out of their potential.
And it highlights the danger of when psychology reinforces power. These psychological frameworks, from Freudian dogma to functionalist sociology, they weren't used as tools for liberation.
No, they were mobilized as tools to mandate adjustment to an unjust status quo. If the world is unequal, the psychologically healthy response, according to this school of thought, is to adjust yourself to fit the mold.
Which raises a critical philosophical question. What is the cost of that forced adjustment?
The cost is one's existence. According to the new psychological thinking that Friedan was citing, adjustment to a confined world without conflict is seen as forfeiting your existence and potential. It leads to a profound, submerged despair.
So you might relieve the symptoms of anxiety.
But it comes at the cost of self-destruction.
Hmm.
True mental health, the book argues, is found in the courage to grapple with and challenge the restrictive environment.
The book's ultimate insight, then, is the pathological result of what you could call identity reduction.
I think that's a great way to put it. When human identity is limited solely to a single biological function, wife and mother, the consequences ripple outward across the entire family unit.
The severe symptoms become the irrefutable evidence of progressive dehumanization.
Exactly. The self-destructive symptoms of the mother alcoholism, nervous breakdowns, even promiscuity driven by a desperate search for identity rather than just sex, that's the direct price paid.
And the next generation's tax bill is the pathologically infantile children, lacking independence and resilience.
When any individual suppresses the basic need to grow and fulfill their potentialities as human beings, that urge to transcend biological survival and contribute creatively, they are effectively being buried alive. The book stands as this powerful testament to the necessity of self-actualization.
So our deep dive really confirms that The Feminine Mystique was not just a book, it was the necessary first step of giving a name to an invisible problem.
It was an extraordinary act of consciousness raising.
It allowed millions of women to stop blaming themselves and, for the first time, to see their dissatisfaction as a signal that the social mold needed breaking.
And the lasting takeaway remains that true social change requires structural, systemic solutions. It requires expanding roles and opportunities, giving women the freedom to commit themselves to meaningful work.
It's not about just moral or psychological adjustment to an unjust world.
Right. We have to recognize that as long as the mystique prevails in any form, it forces women to forfeit their own humanity for the sake of an idealized, yet ultimately destructive cultural image.
And we have seen enormous, undeniable progress. Women now vote in historic numbers, often defining the political agenda, and we've cracked through so many barriers to professional equality. The old mystique is weakened, for sure.
But the systems it created are stubbornly persistent. The fundamental systems of work and care are still struggling to catch up, and that's leading to widespread burnout across both genders.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener.
We've successfully spent decades analyzing the feminine mystique and its profound, crippling effect on women. But the source material also points out that the core crisis of finding purpose through creative, meaningful work, that tension between economic survival and meaningful identity, is increasingly being felt by men as well.
As corporate downsizing, stagnant wages, and the elimination of traditional career paths impact the old model of masculine success.
Men are also facing a systemic identity crisis. So if we acknowledge that both men and women suffer when corporate culture prioritizes quarterly profits over human well-being, what new alliances are needed?
How do we collectively redefine the fundamental bottom line of societal success, the welfare of the people, in a way that liberates both genders from obsolete roles and these unrealistic, soul-crushing economic expectations?
It's a big question.
That concludes our deep dive on Betty Friedan's pivotal, system-defining work, The Feminine Mystique.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author, or borrow it from your local library.
For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.